Hey crew, it's Pitt and I'm back with some more philosophy. Today we are diving back into the works of Georg Hegel. This is The Science of Logic. We are reading aloud and somewhat discussing as we go along the various points brought to light by the text. It is not the format for everyone, but people find value in it, so you are more than welcome to tag along as we continue our exploration. Before we begin, however, if you are unfamiliar with me, any of my unconventional beliefs, or if at any point in time I lose you in the terminology, there will be several playlists linked in the corner above, in the box down below, along with the original source material and the link for my book, so that you can get a better understanding of who I am and why I say the things that I do. With that being said, we are going to dive in and continue our exploration of the science of logic with Part 2, Chapter 3, Ground. Essence determines itself as ground. Just as nothing is at first a simple immediate unity with being, so here too the simple identity of essence is, at first, in simple unity with its absolute negativity. Essence is only this negativity which is pure reflection. It is this pure reflection as the turning back of being into itself. Hence, it is determined in itself, or for us, as the ground into which being resolves itself. But this determinateness is not posited by the essence itself. In other words, essence is not ground precisely because it has not posited this determinateness that it possesses. Its reflection, however, consists in positing itself as what it is in itself, as a negative, and in determining itself. The positive and the negative constitute the essential determination in which essence is lost in its negation. These self-subsisting determinations of reflection sublate themselves, and the determination that has foundered to the ground is the true determination of essence. Consequently, ground is itself one of the reflected determinations of essence, but it is the last, or rather, it is the determination determined as sublated determination. Its foundering to the ground, the determination of reflection, receives its true meaning. That it is the absolute repelling of itself within itself, or, again, that the positedness that accrues to essence is such only as sublated, and, conversely, that only the self-sublating positedness is the positedness of essence. In determining itself as ground, essence determines itself as the not determined, and only the sublating of its being determined is its determining. Essence, in thus being determined as self-sublating, does not proceed from an other, but is, in its negativity, identical with itself. Since the advance to the ground is made starting from determination as an immediate first, is done by virtue of the nature of determination itself that founders to the ground through itself. The ground is at first determined by that immediate first, but this determining is, on the one hand, as the sublating of the determining, the merely restored, purified, or manifested identity of essence, which the determination of reflection is in itself. On the other hand, this negating movement is, as determining, the first positing of that reflective determinateness that appeared as immediate determinateness, but which is posited only by the self-excluding reflection of ground, and therein is posited as only something posited or sublated. Thus, essence, in determining itself as ground, proceeds only from itself. As ground, therefore, it posits itself as essence, and its determining consists in just this positing of itself as essence. This positing is the reflection of essence that sublates itself in its determining. On that side is a positing. On this side is the positing of essence. Hence, both in one act. So basically what this is ground is the basis from which you build upon, right? It is the very base level of what a thing is. Essence becomes that once it is recognized as the determining factor. So, to once again go back to our lighter, right? This is a lighter. The essence of this is that it starts fire. That is the ground from which lighter is determined. right? By determining itself as something that creates fire, it is therefore the ground for which lighters are determined by. Basically. I don't know how much explaining I'm going to be doing in these, right? I try to every once in a while just interject just to make it a different context, but to me, saying that is the exact same as reading this. So I feel kind of like an asshole trying to explain a little bit further than it is already explained. But let me know in the comments if I need to, more or less. Reflection is pure mediation in general. Ground, the real mediation of essence with itself. I think this is a lighter, but if it doesn't light, the lighter doesn't think that it is, right? The reflection of the lighter is the fact that it lights. The former, the movement of nothing through nothing back to itself, is the reflective shining of one in another. But because in this reflection opposition does not yet have any self-subsistence, neither is the one that which shines something positive, nor is the other in which it reflectively shines something negative. Both are substrates, actually of the imagination. They are still not self-referring. Pure mediation is only pure reference, without anything being referred to. Determining reflection, for its part, does posit such terms as are identical with themselves, but these are at the same time only determined references. Ground, on the contrary, is mediation that is real, since it contains reflection as the sublated reflection. It is essence that turns back into itself through its non-being and posits itself. According to this moment of sublated reflection, which is posited, receives the determination of immediacy, of an immediate which is self-identical outside its reference or its reflective shining. This immediacy is being as restored by essence, the non-being of reflection through which essence mediates itself. Essence returns into itself as it negates. Therefore, in its turning back into itself, it gives itself the determinateness that precisely for this reason is the self-identical negative, its sublated positiveness, and, consequently, as the self-identity of essence as ground, equally and existent. The ground is, first, absolute ground, one in which the essence is first of all the general substrate for the ground connection. It then further determines itself as form and matter and gives itself a content. Second, it is determinate ground, the ground of a determinate content, because the ground connection, in being realized, becomes as much external, it passes over into conditioning mediation. Third, ground presupposes a condition, but the condition equally presupposes the ground. The unconditioned is the unity of the two, the fact itself that, by virtue of the mediation of the conditioning reference, passes over into concrete existence. Remark. Ground, like all the other determinations of reflection, is expressed in a principle. Everything has a sufficient ground or reason. In general, this means nothing but this. Anything which is to be considered to exist, not as an immediate, but as a posited. There is no stopping at immediate existence, but a return must rather be made from it back into its ground. And in this reflection it is a sublated being and is in and for itself. What is expressed by the principle of sufficient reason is, therefore, the essentiality of immanent reflection as against mere being. That the ground or reason may be sufficient is, strictly speaking, a totally superfluous addition, for it goes without saying, a thing without sufficient ground would have no ground. Yet everything ought to have a ground. But Leibniz, for whom the principle of sufficient reason was especially dear to his heart and even made it on the basic principle of his whole philosophy, associated a more profound meaning with sufficient than is normally the case when one simply stops at its immediate expression. Although, to be sure, even in this ordinary sense, the proposition is already to be regarded as important, for it says that being as such, in its immediacy, is an untruth, that it is something essentially posited, and that it is the ground which is rather the true immediate. But Leibniz took the sufficiency of the ground, above all, in opposition to causality, taken in its strict sense as mechanical efficiency. Since this motive of efficiency is, as such, an external activity restricted to a single determinateness according to content, the determinations that it posits come associated together externally and accidentally. Taken one by one, the determinations are comprehended through their causes, but their connection, which constitutes what is essential in a concrete existence, is not to be found in mechanical causes. That connection, the whole as an essential unity, is to be found only in the concept, in the purpose. Mechanical causes are not sufficient for this unity, for they do not have as their ground the purpose, which is the unity of the determinations. Accordingly, by sufficient ground, Leibniz understood one that sufficed also for this unity, and comprehended, therefore, not just causes, but final causes. But this definition of ground is at this point still premature. To be a ground in teleological sense is a property of the concept and of the mediation effected through it. And this mediation is reason. Ground. A. Absolute ground. A. Form and essence. The determination of reflection, inasmuch as this determination returns into ground, is of first immediate existence in general from which the beginning is made. But existence still has the only meaning of positiveness and essentially presupposes a ground, in the sense that it does not really posit a ground, that the positing is a sublating of itself, that it is, rather, the immediate that is posited, and the ground the non-posited. As we have seen, this presupposing is the positing that rebounds on that which posits, as sublated determinate being. The ground is not an indeterminate, but is rather essence determined through itself, but determined as indeterminate or as sublated positiveness. It is essence that, in its negativity, is identical with itself. The determinateness of essence as ground is thus twofold. It is the determinateness of the ground and of the grounded. It is, first, essence as ground, essence determined to be essence as against positiveness, as non-positiveness. Second, it is that which is grounded, the immediate that, however, is not anything in and for itself, is posited as positiveness, is positiveness as positiveness. Consequently, this positiveness is equally identical with itself, but in an identity which is that of the negative with itself. The self-identical negative and the self-identical positive are now one and the same identity, for the ground is the self-identity of the positive, or even, also, of positiveness. The grounded is positiveness as positiveness, but this reflection into itself is the identity of the ground. This simple identity, therefore, is not itself ground, for the ground is essence posited as the non-posited, as against positiveness. As the unity of this determinate identity, the ground, and of the negative identity, the grounded, it is essence in general, distinct from its mediation. For one thing, this mediation, compared with the preceding reflections from which it derives, is not pure reflection, which is undistinguished from essence, and still does not have the negative in it. Consequently, also does not, as yet, contain the self-subsistence of the determinations. These have their subsistence, rather, in the ground understood as sublated reflection. And it is also not the determining reflection whose determinations have essential self-subsistence, for that reflection has foundered, has sunk to the ground, and in the unity of the latter the determinations are only posited determinations. The mediation of the ground is thus the unity of pure reflection and determining reflection. Their determinations, or that which is posited, has self-subsistence, and conversely, the self-subsistence of the determinations is a posited subsistence. Since this subsistence of the determinations is itself posited or has determinateness, the determinations are consequently distinguished from their simple identity, and they constitute the form as against essence. Essence has a form and determinations of this form. Only as ground does it have fixed immediacy or is substrate. Essence, as such, is one with its reflection, inseparable from its movement. It is not essence, therefore, through which this movement runs its reflective course, nor is essence that from which the movement begins, as from a starting point. It is this circumstance that above all makes the exposition of reflection especially difficult, for strictly speaking, one cannot say that essence returns into itself, that essence shines in itself, for essence is neither before its movement nor in the movement. This movement has no substrate on which it runs its course. A term of reference arises in the ground, only following upon the moment of sublated reflection. But essence, as the referred to term, is determinate essence, and by virtue of this positiveness, it has form as essence. The determinations of form, on the contrary, are now determinations in the essence. The latter lies at their foundation. As an indeterminate which in its determination is indifferent to them. In it, they are reflected into themselves. The determinations of reflection should have their subsistence in them and be self-subsistent. But their self-subsistence is their dissolution, which they thus have in an other. But this dissolution is itself this self-identity, or the ground of the subsistence that they give to themselves. Everything determinate belongs in general to form. It is a form determination inasmuch as it is something posited and hence distinguished from that of which it is the form. As quality, determinateness is one with its substrate, being. Being is the immediate determinate, yet not distinct from its determinateness, or, in this determinateness, still unreflected into itself. Just as the determinate is, therefore, an existent determinateness, not yet one that is posited. Moreover, the form of determinations of essence are, in their more specific determinateness, the previously considered moments of reflections, identity, and difference. The latter is both diversity and opposition. But also the ground connection belongs among these form determinations of essence, because through it, though itself the sublated determination of reflection, essence is at the same time as posited. By contrast, the identity that has the ground immanent in it does not pertain to form, because positedness, as sublated and as such, as ground and grounded, is one reflection, and this reflection constitutes essence as simple substrate, which is the subsistence of form. But in ground, this subsistence is posited, or this essence is itself essentially as determinate, and, consequently, is in turn also the moment of the ground connection and form. This is the absolute reciprocal connecting reference of form and essence. Essence is the simple unity of ground and grounded, but in this unity is itself determined, or is a negative, and it distinguishes itself as substrate from form. But at the same time it thereby becomes itself ground and moment of form. Form is therefore the completed whole of reflection. It also contains this determination of reflection, that it is sublated. Just like reflection, therefore, it is one unity of its determining, and it is also referred to it is also referred to its sublatedness to another that is not itself form, but in which the form is. As essential self-referring negativity, in contrast with that simple negative, form is positing and determining. Simple essence, on the contrary, is indeterminate and inert substrate, in which the determinations of form have their subsistence and their reflections into themselves. External reflection normally halts at the distinction of essence and form. The distinction is necessary, but the distinguishing itself of the two is their unity, just as this unity of ground is essence, repelling itself from itself and making itself into positiveness. Form is absolute negativity itself, or the negative absolute self-identity, by virtue of which essence is indeed not being but essence. This identity, taken abstractly, is essence as against form, just as negativity, taken abstractly as positiveness, is the one determination of form. But this determination has shown itself to be, in truth, the whole self-referring negativity, which, withdrawn as this identity, thus is simple essence. Consequently, form has essence in its own identity, just as essence has absolute form in its negative nature. One cannot therefore ask how form comes to essence, for form is only the internal reflective shining of essence, its own reflection inhabiting it. Form equally is, within it, the reflection turning back into itself, or the identical essence in its determining. Form makes the determination into positiveness as positiveness. Form, therefore, does not determine essence, as if it were truly presupposed, separate from essence, for it would then be the unessential, constantly foundering determination of reflection. Here, it is itself the ground of its sublating, or the identical reference of its determinations. So, it is the point by which the differentiation happens, right? That's what's being said here. You have the lighter. This is a lighter. It lights fires. But this lighter is different from this lighter, right? The commonality between the two is the ground. They both light fires, right? The parts that sublate are the parts that differentiate. The wrap on this lighter, the shape of this lighter, the size of this lighter is different, right? They are different lighters. They both do the same thing. The ground is the same. The various determinations that separate them are not the ground. They are instead the form. Right? That the form determines the essence means, therefore, that in its distinguishing form sublates this very distinguishing, and is the self-identity that essence is the subsistence of the determinations. Form is the contradiction of being sublated in its positiveness, and yet having subsistence in this sublatedness. It is accordingly ground as essence, which is self-identical in being determined or negated. These distinctions of form and of essence are therefore only moments of the simple reference of form itself, but they must be examined and fixed more closely. Determining form refers itself to itself as sublated positiveness. It thereby refers itself to its identity as to another. It posits itself as sublated. It therefore presupposes its identity. According to this moment, essence is the indeterminate to which form is another. It is not the essence which is absolute reflection within, but essence determined as formless identity. It is matter. B. Form and matter. Essence becomes matter in that its reflection is determined as relating itself to essence, as to the formless indeterminate. Matter, therefore, is the simple identity, void of distinction, that essence is, with the determination that it is the other of form. Hence, it is the proper base, or substrate of form, since it constitutes the immanent reflection of the determinations of form, or the self-subsistent term, to which such determinations refer as to their positive subsistence. If abstraction is made from every determination, from every form of a something, matter is what is left over. Matter is the absolutely abstract. One cannot see, feel, etc. matter. What one sees or feels is a determinate matter, that is, a unity of matter and form. This abstraction from which matter derives is not, however, an external removal and sublation of form. It is, rather, the form itself which, as we have just seen, reduces itself by virtue of itself to this simple identity. So, matter, right? This is the concept that once you assign identity, it is identity, right? And so, once you have determined that this is a lighter, the form becomes less of a necessity. This is the form of this lighter, but it is the form of this lighter through the determinations of the differences from other lighters. This is the abstraction that you can't touch the lighter until it is designated as the lighter, right? If you are touching it, it is something designated. Once you have the observation of it, you categorize it and it becomes designated. You can't touch lighter as the archetype. You can only touch lighter in the determinate form, or the identity. Further, form presupposes a matter to which it refers, but for this reason the two do not find themselves confronting each other externally and accidentally. Neither matter nor form derives from itself. It is ase, or, in other words, is eternal. Matter is indifferent with respect to form, but this indifference is the determinateness of self-identity, to which form returns as its substrate. Form presupposes matter for the very reason that it posits itself as a sublated, hence refers to this, its identity, as to something other. Contrariwise, form is presupposed by matter, for matter is not simple essence, which immediately is itself absolute reflection, but is essence determined as something positive. That is to say, which only is as sublated negation. That's what I just said. But on the other hand, since form posits itself as matter only in sublating itself, hence in presupposing matter, matter is also determined as groundless subsistence, right? Because it is non-designated, matter being a general term, everything is matter, every atom, right? The oxygen, the individual oxygen floating around you right now is matter, but it is identified as oxygen. Equally so, matter is not determined as the ground of form, but rather, inasmuch as matter posits itself as the abstract identity of the sublated determination of form. It is not that identity as ground, and form is therefore groundless with respect to it. Form and matter are consequently alike determined as not to be posited each by the other, each not to be the ground of the other. Matter is rather the identity of the ground and the grounded, as the substrate that stands over against this reference of form. This determination of indifference that the two have in common is the determination of matter as such, and also constitutes their reciprocal reference. The determination of form, that it is the connection of the two as distinct, equally as also the other moment of the relating of the two to each other. Matter, determined as indifferent, is the passive, as contrasted to form, which is determined as the active. This latter, as self-referring negative, is inherently contradiction, self-dissolving, self-repelling, and self-determining. It refers to matter, and it is posited to refer to this matter, which is its subsistence as to another. Matter is posited, on the contrary, as referring only to itself and as indifferent to the other, but implicitly it does refer to the form, for it contains the sublated negativity and is matter only by virtue of this determination. It refers to it as an other only because form is not posited in it, because it is form only implicitly. It contains form locked up inside it, and it is an absolute receptivity for form only because it has the latter within it absolutely, because to be form is its implicit vocation. Hence, matter must be informed, and form must materialize itself. It must give itself self-identity or subsistence in matter. 2. Consequently, form determines matter, and matter is determined by form. Because form is itself absolute self-identity and hence implicitly contains matter, and equally because matter in its pure abstraction or absolute negativity possesses form within it, the activity of the form on the matter and the reception by the latter of the form determination is only the sublating of the semblance of their indifference and distinctness. Thus, the determination referring each to the other is the self-mediation of each through its own non-being. But the two mediations are one movement, and the restoration of their original identity is the inner recollection of their exteriorization. First, form and matter presuppose each other. As we have seen, this only means that the one essential unity is negative self-reference, and that it therefore splits, determined as an indifferent substrate in the essential identity, and as determining form in essential distinction or negativity. That unity of essence and form, the two opposed to each other as form and matter, is the absolute self-determining ground. Inasmuch as this unity differentiates itself, the reference connecting the two diverse terms, because of the unity that underlies them, becomes a reference of reciprocal presupposition. Second, the form already is, as self-subsisting, self-sublating contradiction. But it is also posited as, in this way, self-sublating, for it is self-subsisting and at the same time essentially referred to another, and, consequently, it sublates itself. Since it is itself two-sided, its sublating also has two sides. For one, form sublates its self-existence and transforms itself into something posited, something that exists in an other, and this other is, in its case, matter. For the other, form sublates its determinateness vis-a-vis matter, sublates its reference to it, consequently, its positiveness, and it thereby gives itself subsistence. Its reflection, in thus sublating its positiveness as it is its own identity, into which it passes over. But since form, at the same time, externalizes this identity and posits it over against itself as matter, that reflection of the positiveness into itself is a union with a matter in which it obtains subsistence. In this union, therefore, it is equally both, is united with matter as with something other, in accordance with the first side, vis-a-vis, in that it makes itself into a positiveness, and, in this other, is united with its own identity. The activity of form, by which matter is determined, consists, therefore, in a negative relating of the form to itself. But, conversely, form thereby negatively relates itself to matter also. The movement, however, by which matter becomes determined is just as much the form's own movement. Form is free of matter, but it sublates its self-subsistence. But this, its self-subsistence, is matter itself, for it is in this matter that it has essential identity. It makes itself into a positiveness, but this is one and the same as making matter into something determinate. But, considered from the other side, the form's own identity is at the same time externalized, and matter is its other. For this reason, because form sublates its own self-subsistence, matter is also not determined. But matter only subsists vis-a-vis form, As the negative sublates itself, so does the positive also. And, as the form sublates itself, the determinateness of matter that the latter has vis-a-vis form also falls away. The determinateness, namely, of being the indeterminate subsistence. What appears here as the activity of form is, moreover, just as much the movement that belongs to matter itself. The determination that implicitly exists in matter, what matter is supposed to be, is its absolute negativity. Through it, matter does not just refer to form simply as to an other, but this external other is the form, rather, that matter itself contains locked up within itself. Matter is in itself the same contradiction that form contains, and this contradiction, like its resolution, is only one. But matter is thus in itself self-contradictory because, as indeterminate self-identity, it is at the same time absolute negativity. It sublates itself within. Its identity disintegrates in its negativity, while the latter obtains in it its subsistence. Since matter is therefore determined by form as by something external, it thereby attains its determination, and the externality of the relating, for both form and matter, consists in that each, or rather, in that the original unity of each, in positing, is at the same time presupposing. The result is that self-reference is at the same time a reference to the self as sublated, or is reference to its other. Third, through this movement of form and matter, the original unity of the two is, on the one hand, restored. On the other hand, it is henceforth a posited unity. Matter is just as much a self-determining as this determining is for an activity of form external to it. Contrariwise, form determines only itself, or has the matter that it determines within it. Just as much as in its determining it relates itself to another, and both, the activity of form and the movement of matter, are one and the same thing. Only that the former is an activity, that is, it is the negativity as posited, while the latter is movement or becoming, the negativity as determination existing in itself. The result, therefore, is the unity of the in itself and positedness. Matter is, as such, determined or necessarily has a form, and form is simply material, subsistent form. Inasmuch as form presupposes a matter as its other, it is finite. It is not a ground, but only the active factor. Equally so, matter, inasmuch as it presupposes form as its non-being, is finite matter. It is not the ground of its unity with form, but is, for the latter, only the substrate. But neither this infinite matter nor the infinite form have any truth. Each refers to the other, or only their unity is the truth. The two determinations return to this unity, and there they sublate their self-subsistence. The unity thereby proves to be their ground. Consequently, matter is the ground of its form determination, not as matter, but only inasmuch as it is the absolute unity of essence and form. Similarly, form is the ground of the subsistence of its determinations only to the extent that it is that same one unity. But this one unity, as absolute negativity, and more specifically as exclusive unity, is, in its reflection, a presupposing. Or again, that unity is one act of preserving itself as positedness in positing, and of repelling itself from itself, of referring itself to itself as itself, and to itself as to another. Or, the act by which matter is determined by form is the self-mediation of essence as ground, in one unity, through itself and through the negation of itself. Informed matter, or form, that possesses subsistence is now not only this absolute unity of ground with itself, but also unity as posited. The movement just considered, is the one in which the absolute ground has exhibited its moments at once as self-sublating and consequently as posited. Or the restored unity, in withdrawing into itself, has repelled from itself and has determined itself. For its unity has been established through negation and is, therefore, also negative unity. It is, therefore, the unity of form and matter as the substrat of both, but a substrate which is determinate. It is formed matter, but matter at the same time indifferent to form and matter, indifferent to them because sublated and unessential. This is content. C. Form and content. Form stands at first over against essence. It is then the ground connection in general, and its determinations are the ground and the grounded. It then stands over against matter, and so it is determining reflection, and its determinations are the determination of reflection itself and the subsistence of the latter. Finally, it stands over against content, and then its determinations are again itself and matter. What was previously the self-identical, at first the ground, then subsistence in general, and finally matter, now passes under the dominion of form, and is once more one of its determinations. Content has, first, a form, and a matter that belong to it essentially. It is their unity. But because this unity is at the same time determinate or posited unity, content stands over against form. The latter constitutes the positedness, and the unessential over against content. The latter is, therefore, indifferent towards form. Form embraces both the form as such as well as the matter, and content, therefore, has a form and a matter, of which it constitutes the substrate and which are, to it, mere positedness. Content is, second, what is identical in form and matter, so that these would be only indifferent external determinations. They are positedness in general, but a positedness that has returned in the content to its unity or its ground. The identity of the content with itself is, therefore, in one respect, that identity which is indifferent to form, but in another, the identity of ground. The ground has at first disappeared into content, but content is at the same time the negative reflection of the form determinations into themselves. Its unity, at first only the unity indifferent to form, is therefore also the formal unity or the ground connection as such. Content, therefore, has this ground connection as its essential form, and, contrariwise, the ground has a content. The content of the ground is, therefore, the ground that has returned into its unity with itself. The ground is, at first, the essence that, in its positedness as it is identical with itself, as diverse from and indifferent to its positedness. The ground is indeterminate matter, but, as content, it is at the same time informed identity, and this form becomes, for this reason, a ground connection, since the determinations of its oppositions are posited in the content also as negated. Content is further determined within, not like matter as an indifferent in general, but like informed matter, so that the determinations of form have a material, indifferent subsistence. On the one hand, content is the essential self-identity of the ground in its positedness. On the other hand, it is posited identity as against the ground connection. This positedness, which is in this identity as determination of form, stands over against the free positedness, that is to say, over against the form as the whole connection of ground and grounded. This form is the total positedness returning into itself. The other form, therefore, is only the positedness as immediate, the determinateness as such. The ground has thus made itself into a determinate ground in general, and the determinateness is itself twofold, of form. I lost it. Twofold, of form first and of content second. The former is its determinateness of being external to the content as such, the content that remains indifferent to this external reference. The latter is the determinateness of the content that the ground has. B. Determinate ground. A. Formal ground. The ground has a determinate content. For the form, as we have seen, the determinateness of content is the substrate, the simple immediate as against the mediation of form. The ground is negatively self-referring identity, which, for this reason, makes itself into a positiveness. It negatively refers to itself because, in its negativity, it is identical with itself. This identity is the substrate, or the content, which thus constitutes the indifferent or positive unity of the ground connection, and, in this connection, is the mediating factor. In this content, the determinateness that the ground and the grounded have over against one another has at first disappeared. The mediation, however, is also negative unity. The negative implicit in that indifferent substrate is this substrate's immediate determinateness, through which the ground has a determinate content. But then, the negative is the negative reference of form to itself. What has been posited sublates itself on its side and returns to its ground. The ground, however, the essential self-subsistence, refers negatively to itself and makes itself into a positiveness. The negative mediation of ground and grounded is the mediation that belongs to form as such, formal mediation. Now, both sides of form, because each passes over into the other, thereby mutually posit themselves into one identity as sublated. In this, they presuppose the identity. The latter is the determinate content to which the formal mediation thus refers itself through itself as to the positive mediating factor. That content is the identical element of both, and because the two are distinct, yet in their distinction, each is the reference to the other, is their subsistence, the subsistence of each as the whole itself. Accordingly, the result is that in the determinate ground we have the following. First, a determinate content is considered from two sides. Once, insofar as it is ground, then again, insofar as it is grounded. The content itself is indifferent to these forms. It is, in each, simply and solely one determination. Second, the ground is itself just as much a moment of form as what is posited by it. This is its identity according to form. It is a matter of indifference, which of the two determinations is made the first, whether the transition is from the one as posited to the other as ground, or from the one as ground to the other as posited. The grounded, considered for itself, is sublating of itself. It thereby makes itself on the one side into a posited, and, at the same time, the positing of the ground. The same movement is the ground as such. It makes itself into something posited, and thereby becomes the ground of something. That is to say, is present therein both as a posited and also first as ground. That there be a ground, of that the posited is the ground, and conversely, the ground is thereby the posited. The mediation begins just as much from the one as from the other. Each side is just as much the ground as posited, and each is the whole mediation, or the whole form. Further, the whole form is itself, as self-identical, the substrate of the two determinations that constitute the two sides of the ground and the grounded. Form and content are thus themselves one and the same identity. Because of this identity of the ground and the grounded, according both to content and form, the ground is sufficient. the sufficiency being limited to this relation. There is nothing in the grounded which is not in the ground. Whenever one asks for a ground, one expects to see the same determination, which is the content doubled, once in the form of that which is posited, and again in the form of existence reflected into itself, of essentiality. Now, inasmuch as the determined ground, the ground and the grounded, are each the whole form, and their content, though determinate, is nevertheless one and the same, the two sides of the ground do not, as yet, have a real determination, do not have a different content. The determinateness is only one simple determinateness that has yet to pass over into the two sides. The determinate ground is present only in its pure form as formal ground. Because the content is only this simple determinateness, one that does not have in it the form of the ground connection, the determinateness is a self-identical content indifferent to form, and the form is external to it. The content is other than the form. Remark. When the search for determinate grounds does not go past the form of ground, as we have just developed, then the assigning of a ground remains a mere formalism, the empty tautology of repeating in the form of immanent reflection, of essentiality, the same content already present in the form of immediate existence considered as posited. This exercise of assigning grounds is, for this reason, just as empty as any discourse only governed by the principle of identity. The sciences, especially the physical sciences, are full of tautologies of this kind, which, apparently, constitute the prerogative of science. For instance, the ground for the planets moving around the sun is given to be the reciprocal attractive force of the sun and the earth. So far as content goes, this says no more than what is contained in the phenomenon, namely, that the movements of the two bodies are correlated, except that it is expressed in the form of a determination reflected into itself, that of force. If it is asked what kind of force this attractive force might be, the answer is that it is the force that makes the earth move around the sun. That is to say, it has exactly the same content as the existence for which it is supposed to be the ground. The connection of the earth and sun with respect to motion is the identical substrate of the ground and grounded. When a form of crystallization is explained in this way, namely that it is grounded in the particular arrangement into which the molecules enter with one another, the actual crystallization is this arrangement itself, except expressed as ground. These etiologies, which are the privilege of the sciences, are valued in ordinary life for what they are, tautological, empty talk. If to the question, why does this man travel to the city, one were to give as ground that there is in the city an attractive force impelling him to it, this kind of answer would be deemed brainless. Yet it is the kind of answer which is sanctioned in the sciences. Leibniz accused Newton's force of attraction of being precisely the kind of occult quality that the scholastics used for the purpose of explanation. One should rather accuse it of being the opposite of occult, that it is all too known a quality, for it has no other content than the phenomena itself. What recommends this manner of explanation is its great clarity and easy comprehension, for there is nothing clearer and more open to comprehension than that a plant, for instance, has its ground in a vegetative, that is, plant-producing force. Such a force might be called an occult quality only in the sense that a ground ought to have another content than what is to be explained. But no such content is given, and in that sense, of course, the force appealed to for explanation is a hidden ground, the required but not given ground. Something is no more explained by this formalism than is the nature of a plant known when I say that it is a plant. For all the clarity of the statement or of the claim that the plant has its ground in a plant-producing force, and just because of that clarity, one can indeed call this a very occult manner of explanation. Secondly, as regards form, In this kind of explanation, the two opposite directions of the ground connection are adduced without being apprehended in their determinate relation. On the one hand, the ground is ground as the eminently reflected content determination of the existence which it grounds. On the other hand, it is that which is posited. It is that on the basis of which that existence is supposed to be understood, but conversely, it is inferred from the latter and is understood from it. The main business of this reflection, thus, consists in gleaning the ground from an existence, that is, in converting the immediate existence into the form of reflected being. Consequently, the ground, instead of being self-subsisting in and for itself, is rather that which is posited and derived. And since, on this procedure, the ground is arranged to fit the phenomenon, and its determinations depend on the latter, the phenomenon, unhindered, flows smoothly out of the ground with full wind in its sails. But, in this way, knowledge has not advanced an inch. It runs in circles, making formal distinctions which the procedure itself overturns and sublates. One of the main difficulties in making progress in the study of the sciences in which this procedure is the rule is due precisely to this wrong-headed procedure of premising as ground that which is in fact derived, and in fact producing in what follows, once one gets there, the ground of this previously supposed ground. The exposition begins with grounds that are floated as principles and original concepts. They are simple determinations lacking necessity in and for themselves. What follows is supposed to be based on them. Therefore, anyone who would penetrate such sciences must begin by assimilating these grounds, and this is a business that reason finds unsavory, for it requires accepting as groundwork what is in fact groundless. More conducive to progress is to accept such principles as given, without much reflection, and then to use them as a fundamental rules of one's understanding. Without this method, one cannot make a start, nor without it can one make any advance. But the advance is hindered by the movement, the advance is hindered by the moment the method shows its hand by reversing itself and looks for the derived in the consequent, when in fact it is the derived that alone contains the grounds of the above presuppositions. Further, because the consequent powers proves to be the phenomenon from which the ground was derived, this relation into which the phenomena is cast raises suspicions about the way it is presented, for the phenomenon is not in fact expressed in the immediacy of a phenomenon, but as evidence for the ground. But because the latter, through the ground, is derived from the phenomenon, all the more so would one wish to see the phenomena in its immediacy in order to be able to pass judgment on how the ground is derived from it. In an exposition of this kind, where the true ground comes out as the derived, one never knows what to make of either the ground or the phenomenon, and the uncertainty grows, particularly when the procedure is not rigorously consistent but is more honest, when the phenomenon betrays traces and circumstances that point to other things, and often entirely different things, than are contained in the principles alone. Lastly, the confusion grows even greater when hypothetical determinations that are the product of reflection are blended with the immediate determinations of the phenomena itself, and are then spoken of as if they belong to immediate experience. Many who come to these sciences in good faith may well believe, from the way in which these things are spoken of in them as immediate determinations of existence, that molecules, empty interstices, centrifugal force, ether, the separate ray of light, electrical and magnetic matter, and an assortment of other like things or relations, are actually to be found in perception. They serve as first grounds for other things. They are spoken of and deliberately made use of as actual things. In good faith, one accepts them as such, before one realizes that they are determinations inferred from that which they are supposed to ground. Hypotheses and fictions derived by an uncritical reflection. In fact, one finds oneself in a kind of witch's circle in which determinations of existence and determinations of reflection, ground and grounded, phenomena and phantoms, mix in promiscuous company, enjoying equal rank in common. Along with the formal business of this method of explaining from grounds, one also hears it repeatedly said, in spite of all the explaining done on the basis of well-known forces and matters, that we do not know the inner essence of these same forces and matters. This can only be seen as an admission that this method of explaining from grounds does not satisfy its own expectations, that it itself demands something quite different from such grounds. But it is then difficult to see why so much effort, goes into that explaining, why that different something is not sought for, or at least why the explaining is not set aside and the facts are not taken as they simply stand. B. Real ground. The determinateness of ground is, as we have seen, on the one hand, determinateness of the substrate or content determination. On the other hand, it is the otherness in the ground connection itself, namely, the distinctness of its content and the form. The connection of ground and grounded strays into the content as an external form, and the content is indifferent to these determinations. But in fact, the two are not external to each other, for this is what the content is, to be the identity of the ground with itself in the grounded, and of the grounded in the ground. The side of the ground has shown itself to be a posited, and the side of the grounded to be itself ground, each side of this identity of the whole within it. But since they equally belong to form and its determinate difference, each is, in its determinateness, the identity of the whole with itself. Consequently, each has a diverse content as against the other, or, considering the matter from the side of the content, since the latter is the self-identity of the ground connection, it essentially possesses this difference of form within, and is as ground something other than what is as grounded. Now, the moment ground and grounded have a diverse content, the ground connection has ceased to be a formal one. The turning back to the ground and the procession forward from ground to posited is no longer a tautology. The ground is realized. Henceforth, whenever we ask for a ground, we actually demand another content determination for it than the determination of the content whose ground we are asking for. This connection now determines itself further. For inasmuch as its two sides are of a different content, they are indifferent to each other. Each is an immediate, self-identical determination. Moreover, as referred to each other as ground and grounded, the ground itself reflects itself in the other, as in something posited by it, back to itself. The content on the side of the ground, therefore, is equally in the grounded. The latter, as the posited, has its self-identity and subsistence only in the ground. But besides this content of the ground, the grounded now possesses a content of its own, and is accordingly the unity of a twofold content. Now, this unity, as the unity of sides that are different, is indeed their negative unity. But, since the two determinations of content are indifferent to each other, that unity is only their empty reference to each other, in itself void of content, and not their mediation. It is a one, or a something, externally holding them together. In the real grounding connection, there is present, therefore, a twofold. For one thing, the content determination, which is ground, extends continuously into the positiveness, so that it constitutes the simple identity of the ground and the grounded. The grounded thus contains the ground fully within itself. Their connection is one of undifferentiated, essential compactness. Anything else in the grounded, added to this simple essence, is, therefore, only an unessential form, external determinations of the content that, as such, are free from the ground and constitute an immediate manifold. Of this unessential more, therefore, the essential is not the ground, nor is it the ground of any connection between it and the unessential in the grounded. The unessential is a positively identical element that resides in the grounded, but does not posit itself there in any distinctive form, as self-referring content. It is rather an indifferent, positive substrate. For another thing, that which in the something is linked with the substrate is an indifferent content, but as the unessential side. The main thing is the connection of the substrate and the unessential manifold. But this connection, since the determinations that it connects are an indifferent content, is also not a ground. True, one determination is determined as essential content, and the other only as only unessential or as positive. But this form is to each as a self-referring content, an external one. The one of the something that constitutes their connection is for this reason not a reference of form, but only an external tie that does not hold the unessential manifold content as posited. It too is therefore likewise only a substrate. Ground, in determining itself as real, because of the diversity of the content that constitutes its reality, thus breaks down into external determinations. The two connections of the essential reality, content as the simple immediate identity of ground and grounded, and then the something connecting distinct contents, are two different substrates. The self-identical form of ground, according to which one and the same thing is at one time the essential and at another the posited, has vanished. The ground connection has thus become external to itself. Consequently, it is an external ground that now holds together a diversified content and determines what is ground and what is posited by it. This determination is not to be found in the two-sided content itself. The real ground is therefore the reference to another, on the one hand, of a content to another content, and, on the other, of the ground connection itself, the form, to another, namely, to an immediate, to something not posited by it. Remark. The formal ground connection has only one content for the ground and the grounded. Its necessity rests on this identity, but so does its tautological nature. The real ground has a diversified content. With this content, however, there also comes a contingency and the externality of the ground connection. On the one hand, that which is considered as essential, and therefore as the ground determination, is not the ground of other determinations that are linked to it. On the other hand, it is also undetermined which of the several content determinations of a concrete thing should be taken as the essential and as ground. The choice between them is free. For instance, as regards the first point, the ground of a house is its foundation. This is so because of the gravity which is inherent in sensuous matter, and this gravity is perfectly identical in both the ground of the house and the grounded house. Now, that there is in heavy matter a distinction as that of a foundation and a modification of it, distinct from it, through which it constitutes a habitation. This is to gravity itself totally indifferent. The reference connecting it to the other content determinations, the purpose, the furnishings of the house, etc., is external to it. Gravity, therefore, though it is the common substrate of the determinations constituting the house, is not the ground of it as house. Accordingly, gravity is just as much the ground for a house standing up as for a stone falling down. The stone has this ground, gravity, in itself, but the fact that it has a further content determination by which it is not just something heavy but a stone, this is external to gravity. And one must look elsewhere than in gravity for the cause that removed the stone from the ground on which it then falls. Similarly, the time and space of the fall and their correlation, the motion of falling, are of another content than gravity and can be conceived of without it, as is commonly said, and therefore are not essentially posited by it. Gravity is equally the ground that makes the upward trajectory of a projectile the opposite counterpart of the falling trajectory. It is clear from the diversity of the determinations for which gravity is the ground that something else is required that will make it the ground of this determination or that. When it is said of nature that it is the ground of the world, then what is called nature is, on the one hand, one with the world, and the world nothing but nature itself. On the other hand, the two are also different, nature being rather the indeterminate, or at least determinate only as the essence of the world, self-identical in the universal differences that are laws. To be a world, a manifold of determinations is still to be externally added to it. But these determinations do not have their ground in nature as such, which is rather indifferent with respect to them as accidentalities. We have the same relation when God is defined as the ground of nature. As ground, he is the essence of nature. Nature contains him within it, and is identical with him, but nature has yet another manifold, which is distinct from the ground itself. This manifold is a third, in which these two diverse sides, God and nature, are linked together. The side of the ground is neither the ground of the manifold, which is different from him, nor of his link with it. There is, therefore, no cognition of nature to be had from God as the ground, for God would then be only nature's universal essence, and, as such, would not contain in it its determinate essence or as nature. Because of the diversity of content between the ground, or more appropriately the substrate, and that which is grounded is linked to it, the assigning of real grounds is no less of a formalism than is the formal ground itself. In the latter, the self-identical content is indifferent to form, and the same applies to the real ground. In its case, it further follows that the real ground does not have a specifically within it the wherewithal for determining, which in a manifold of determinations is to be taken as the essential. Something is a concrete something. Its manifold determinations are, to all appearances, equally stable and permanent in it. Any of them, therefore, can be taken as ground no less than the other, that is to say, can be taken as the essential determination, and, in comparison to it, the others would be, then, only something posited. We go back here to what we noted earlier, namely, that from the fact that a determination is deemed in one case to be the ground of another, it does not follow that this other is posited with it in another case or at all. Punishment, for instance, has a variety of determinations, that it is retribution, and also a deterrent example, a deterring threat made by the law, and also a contribution to the self-awareness and betterment of the culprit. Each of these different determinations has been regarded as the ground of punishment, on the ground that it is the essential determination, and by default the others, since they are different from it, have been regarded as only accidental. But the one determination which is assumed as ground does not amount to the whole punishment. The latter, as something concrete, also contains all of the rest, and in it they are only linked to the first without having their ground in it. Or, again, a civil servant has a talent for his office. As an individual has family relations, has a number of acquaintances, a particular character was called upon to prove himself under such and such circumstances and on such and such occasions, etc. Now, each of these properties can be regarded to be the ground of his being a civil servant. They are a diversified content held together in the third, the form, in which they are determined relatively to each other as essential and posited, is external to this content. To the civil servant, each of the properties is essential, for it is by virtue of them that he is the determinate individual that he is, since his office can be regarded as a determination externally posited in him. Each of the rest can be determined as a ground with respect to it, but, conversely, they too can be regarded as posited, and the office as their ground. How they relate actually, that is, in this singular case, is a determination external to the grounding connection and to the content itself. It is a third that confers on them the form of ground and grounded. So, in general, every existence can have several grounds. Each of its content determinations pervades the concrete whole while retaining its identity, and thus allows the possibility that it be regarded as essential because of the contingency of the link connecting them. The door is left wide open to a multitude of points of view, that is, determinations that lie outside the fact itself. Whether a ground has this or that consequence is therefore equally accidental. For instance, moral motives are essential determinations of ethical nature, but what follows from them is at the same time an externality distinct from them, one that may or may not follow from them, but is attached to them only by virtue of a third factor. Or, to be more precise, if the moral determination is a ground, it is not accidental to it that it should have a consequence, or that something be grounded by it, but that it should be made into a ground in the first place. That is accidental. But again, since the content which is its consequence has the nature of externality, when the determination is made into a ground, it can be immediately sublated by some other externality. From a moral motive, therefore, an action can proceed, but can also not proceed. Conversely, an action can have several grounds. As something concrete, it contains a manifold of essential determinations, each of which can, therefore, be offered as the ground. The search and the assigning of grounds, which is the special domain of argumentation, is, for this reason, an endless meandering without final destination. For each and every good thing, in each and everything, good grounds can be adduced, but so they can for its opposite just as well. And there can be a great many grounds with nothing following them. What Socrates and Plato call sophistry is nothing else than argumentation from grounds. Plato opposed it to the examination of the idea, that is, of a fact in and for itself, or in its concept. Grounds are taken only from essential determinations of content, relations, and points of view, of which each fact, and also its opposite, can have several. In their form of essentiality, each is just as valid as the next. Each is a one-sided ground, because none contains the whole compass of the fact, for which other particular sides then provide other particular grounds. And none exhausts the fact that links them together and contains them all. None is the sufficient ground or reason, that is, the concept. C. Complete ground. 1. In real ground, ground as content and ground as connection are only substrates. The former is only posited as essential and as ground. The connection is what the grounded immediately is as the indeterminate substrate of a diversified content. A linking of this content, which is not the content's own reflection, but is rather external, and consequently a reflection which is only positive. The real ground connection is ground, therefore, rather as sublated. Consequently, it rather makes up the side of the grounded, or of the positedness. As positedness, however, the ground itself has now returned to its ground. It is now something grounded. It has another ground. This ground will therefore be so determined that, first, it is identical with the ground by which it is grounded. Both sides have in this determination one and the same content. The two content determinations and their linkage in a something are equally to be found in the new ground. But, second, the new ground into which the previously merely posited and external link is now sublated is the immanent reflection of this link, the absolute reference of the two content determinations to each other. Because real ground has itself thus returned to its ground, the identity of ground and grounded, or the formality of ground, reasserts itself in it. The newly arisen ground connection is therefore the one which is complete, which contains the formal and real ground in itself at the same time, and mediates the content determinations which, in the real ground, confronted each other immediately. 2. Thus, the ground connection has more precisely determined itself as follows. First, something has a ground. It contains the content determination which is the ground, and, in addition, a second determination as posited by the ground. But, because of the indifference of content, the one determination is not the ground in itself, nor is the other in itself the one that is grounded by the first. This connection of ground and grounded is rather sublated, and the immediacy of their content is posited, and, as such, its ground is in another such connection. Since this second connection is distinguished only according to form, it has the same content as the first. It still has the same two determinations of content, but is now their immediate linking together. This linking, however, is of a general nature, and the content, therefore, is diversified in two determinations that are indifferent to each other. The linking is not, therefore, their true absolute connection that would make one determination the element of self-identity in the positiveness, and the other determination the positiveness of this same self-identity. On the contrary, the two are supported by a something, and this something is what connects them, but in a connection which is not reflected. It is, rather, only immediate, and therefore only a relative ground, as against the linking in the other something. The two somethings are, therefore, the two distinct connections of content that have transpired. They stand in the identical ground connection of form. They are one and the same whole content, namely, the two content determinations and their connection. They are distinct only by the kind of this connection, which is the one, and in which in the one is an immediate, and in the other a posited connection. Through this, they are distinguished from one another as ground and grounded, only according to form. Second, this ground connection is not only formal but also real. Formal ground passes over into real ground, as it has been shown. The moments of the form reflect themselves into themselves. They are self-subsistent content, and the ground connection contains also one content with the character of ground and another with that of grounded. The content constitutes at first the immediate identity of both sides of the formal ground. So the two sides have one and the same content, but the content also has the form in it, and so it is a twofold content that behaves as ground and grounded. One of the two content determinations of the two somethings is therefore determined not merely as being common to them according to external comparison, but as their identical substrate and the foundation of their connection. As against the other determination of the content, this determination is essential and is the ground of the other which is posited, that is, posited in the something, the connection of which is the grounded. In the first something, which is the ground connection, this second determination of the content is also immediately and in itself linked with the first. But the other something only contains the one determination in itself as that in which it is immediately identical with the first something, but the other as the one which is posited in it. The former content determination is its ground by virtue of its being originally linked in the first something with the other content determination. The ground connection of the content determinations in the second something is thus mediated through the connection present in the first something. The inference is this: since determination B is implicitly linked with determination A in a something, in a second something to which only the one determination A immediately belongs, also B is linked with it. In the second something, not only is this second determination mediated, also mediated is that its immediate ground is mediated, namely by virtue of its original connection with B in the first something. This connection is thus the ground of the ground A, and the whole ground connection is present in the second something as posited or grounded. 3. Real ground shows itself to be the self-external reflection of ground. Its complete mediation is the restoration of its identity with itself, but because this identity has in the process equally acquired the externality of real ground, the formal ground connection in this unity of itself and real ground is just as much self-positing as self-sublating ground. The ground connection mediates itself with itself through its negation. The ground is at first as the original connection, the connection of immediate content determinations. The ground connection, being essential form, has for sides such that are sublated or as are moments. Consequently, as the form of immediate determinations, it connects itself with itself as self-identical, while at the same time connecting with their negation. Accordingly, it is ground, not in and for itself, but as connected with the sublated ground connection. Second, the sublated connection, or the immediate, which in the original and in the positive connection is the identical substrat, is likewise real ground, not in and for itself. That it is ground is rather posited by virtue of that original link. Thus, the ground connection is, in its totality, essentially presupposing reflection. Formal ground presupposes the immediate content determination, and this content presupposes form as real ground. Ground is therefore form as an immediate linkage, but in such a manner that it repels itself from itself and rather presupposes immediacy, referring itself therein as to another. This immediate is the content determination, the simple ground, but as such, that is, as ground, it is equally repelled from itself and refers itself to itself equally as to another. Thus, the total ground connection has taken on the determination of conditioning mediation. C. Condition. A. The relatively unconditioned. 1. Ground is the immediate, and the grounded the mediated. But ground is positing reflection. As such, it makes itself into positiveness and is presupposing reflection. As such, it refers itself as to something sublated, to an immediate through which it is itself mediated. This mediation, as an advance from the immediate to the ground, is not an external reflection, but, as we have seen, the ground's own doing, or, what is the same, the ground connection, as reflection into its self-identity, is just as essentially self-externalizing reflection. The immediate to which the ground refers, as to its essential presupposition, is condition. Real ground is accordingly essentially conditioned. The determinateness that it contains is the otherness of itself. Condition is therefore, first, an immediate manifold existence. Second, it is this existence referred to another, to something which is ground, not of this existence, but in some other respect. For existence itself is immediate and without ground. According to this reference, it is something posited as condition. The immediate existence is supposed to be not for itself, but for another. But this, that it thus is for another, is at the same time itself only a positiveness. That it is posited is sublated in its immediacy. An existence is indifferent to being a condition. Third, condition is something immediate in the sense that it constitutes the presupposition of ground. In this determination, it is the form connection of ground withdrawn into self-identity, hence the content of ground. But content is, as such, only the indifferent unity of ground, as in the form. Without form, no content. It nevertheless frees itself from this indifferent unity in that ground connection, in the complete ground, becomes a connection external to its identity, whereby content acquires immediacy. Insofar, therefore, as a condition is that in which the ground connection has its identity with itself, it constitutes the content of the ground. But since this content is indifferent to form, it is only implicitly the content of form, is something which has yet to become content, and hence constitutes the material for the ground. Posited as condition, and in accordance with the second moment, existence is determined to lose its indifferent immediacy, and to become the moment of another. By virtue of its immediacy, it is indifferent to this connection, inasmuch as it enters into it. However, it constitutes the in itself of the ground, and is, for it, the unconditioned. In order to be conditioned, it has its presupposition in the ground, and is itself conditioned, but this condition is external to it. An easy way to think about this is the lighter without fluid, right? It is a lighter. It is meant to start fires. It is meant to have fluid. The condition of this lighter right now is a lighter. But once the fluid is gone, it is a non-working lighter. The condition is non-working. The function should be the same, but it is not able to be the same because the condition has changed. 2. Something is not through its condition. Its condition is not its ground. Condition is for the ground the moment of unconditioned immediacy, but is not itself the movement and the positing that refers itself to itself negatively, and then makes itself into a positiveness. Over against condition there stands therefore the ground connection. Something has, besides its condition, also a ground. This ground is the empty movement of reflection, for the latter has the immediacy which is its presupposition outside it. But it is the whole form and the self-subsistent process of mediation, for the condition is not its ground. Since this mediating refers itself to itself as positing, it equally is, according to this side, something immediate and unconditioned. It does indeed presuppose itself, but as an externalized or sublated positing. Whatever it is in accordance with its determination, that it is. On the contrary, in and for itself. Inasmuch as the ground connection is thus a self-subsisting self-reference and has within it the identity of reflection, it has a content which is peculiarly its own, as against the content of the condition. The one content is that of the ground and is, therefore, essentially informed. The other content, that of the condition, is on the contrary only an immediate material whose connecting reference to the ground, while at the same time constituting the in itself of the latter, is also equally external to it. It is thus a mingling of a self-subsisting content that has no reference to the content of the ground determination and of the content that enters into the latter and, as its material, should become a moment of it. 3. The two sides of the whole, condition and ground, are thus, on the one hand, indifferent and unconditioned with respect to each other. The one as the non-referred to side, to which the connecting reference in which it is the condition is external. The other as the connecting reference, or form, for which the determinate existence of the condition is only a material, something passive, whose form, such as it possesses on its own account, is unessential. On the other hand, the two sides are also mediated. Condition is the in itself of the ground. So much is it the essential moment of the ground connection that it is the simple self-identity of the ground. But this also is sublated. This, in itself, is only something posited. Immediate existence is indifferent to being a condition. The fact, therefore, that condition is the in itself of the ground constitutes the side of it by which it is a mediated condition. Likewise, the ground connection has in its self-subsistence also a presupposition. It has its in itself outside itself. Consequently, each of the two sides of this contradiction, that they are indifferent immediacy and essential mediation, both in one reference, or the contradiction of independent subsistence and of being determined as only moments. B. The absolutely unconditioned. At first, each of the two relatively unconditioned sides reflectively shines in each other. Condition as an immediate is reflected in the form connection of the ground, and this form in the immediate existence has its positiveness. But each, apart from this reflective shine of its other in it, stands out on its own and has a content of its own. Condition is at first immediate existence. Its form has these two moments, that of positiveness, according to which it is, as condition, material, and moment of the ground, and that of the in itself, according to which it constitutes the essentiality of ground, or its simple reflection into itself. Both sides of the form are external to immediate existence, for the latter is the sublated ground connection. But, first, existence is in it only this, to sublate itself in its immediacy and to founder going to the ground. Being is, as such, only the becoming of essence. It is its essential nature to make itself into a positiveness and into an identity which is an immediacy through the negation of itself. The form determinations of positiveness and of self-identical in itself, the form through which immediate existence is conditioned, are not, therefore, external to that existence. The latter is rather this very reflection. Second, as condition, being is now posited as that which is it essentially is, namely, as a moment, and, consequently, as the being of an other, and at the same time as the in itself of an other. It is in itself, but only through the negation of itself, namely, through the ground, and through its self-sublating and consequent presupposing reflection. The in itself of being is thus only something posited. This in itself of the condition has two sides. One side is its essentiality, as essentiality of the ground, while the other is the immediacy of its existence. Or rather, both sides are the same thing. Existence is an immediate, but immediacy is essentially something mediated, namely through the self-sublating ground. Existence, as this immediacy mediated by a self-sublating mediating, is at the same time the in itself of the ground and its unconditioned side. But again, this itself is at the same time equally only moment, or positiveness, since it is mediated. Condition is, therefore, the whole form of the ground connection. It is the presupposed in itself of the latter, but consequently, it is itself a positiveness, and its immediacy is this: to make itself into a positiveness, and thereby to repel itself from itself in such a way that it both founders to the ground and is ground. The ground that makes itself into a positiveness and thereby into a grounded are both, and both are one and the same. Likewise, in the conditioned ground, the in itself is not just as the reflective shining of an other in it. The ground is the self-subsistent, that is, self-referring reflection of the positing, and consequently the self-identical. Or it is in itself and its content. Say that 3 times fast. But it is at the same time presupposing reflection. It negatively refers to itself and posits it in itself as another opposite to it. And condition, according to both its moment of it in itself and of immediate existence, is the ground connection's own moment. The immediate existence, essentially, is only through its ground and is a moment of itself as a presupposing. This ground, therefore, is equally the whole itself. What we have here, therefore, is only one whole of a form, but equally so only one whole of content. For the proper content of condition is essential content, only insofar as it is the self-identity of reflection in the form, or the ground connection is in it this immediate existence. Further, this existence is conditioned only through the presupposing reflection of the ground. It is the ground's self-identity, or its content, to which the ground posits itself as opposite. Therefore, the existence is not a merely formless material for the ground connection. On the contrary, because it has this form in it, it is informed matter, and because, in its identity with it, it is at the same time indifferent to it, it is content. Finally, it is the same content as that possessed by the ground, for it is precisely content as that which is self-identical in the form of connection. The two sides of the whole, condition and ground, are therefore one essential unity, as content as well as form. They pass into one another, or, since they are reflections, they posit themselves as sublated, refer themselves to this their negation, and reciprocally presuppose each other. But this is at the same time only one reflection of the two, and their presupposing is therefore one presupposing only. The reciprocity of this presupposing ultimately amounts to this, that they both presuppose one identity for their subsistence and their substrate. This substrate, the one content and unity of form of both, is the truly unconditioned, the fact in itself. Condition is, as was shown above, only the relatively unconditioned. It is unusual, therefore, to consider it as something conditioned and to ask for a new condition, whereby the customary progression ad infinitum from condition to condition is set in motion. But now, Why is it that at one condition a new condition is asked for? That is, why is that condition assumed to be something conditioned? Because it is some finite, determinate existence or other. But this is a further determination of condition that does not enter into its concept. Condition is, as such, conditioned solely because it is the posited in itselfness. It is, therefore, sublated in the absolutely unconditioned. Now, this contains within itself the two sides, condition and ground, as its moments. It is the unity to which they have returned. Together, the two constitute its form or its positedness. The unconditioned fact is the condition of both, but the condition which is absolute, that is to say, one which is itself ground, as ground, the fact is now the negative identity that has repelled itself into these two moments. First, in the shape of the sublated ground connection, the shape of an immediate manifold void of unity and external to itself, one that refers to the ground as another to it, and, at the same time, constitutes it in itself. Second, in the shape of an inner, simple form, which is ground, but which refers to the self-identical immediate as to another, determining it as condition. That is, determining the in itself of it as its own moment. These two sides presuppose the totality, presuppose that it is that which posits them. Contrariwise, because they presuppose the totality, the latter seems to be in turn also conditioned by them, and the fact to spring forth from its condition and its ground. But since these two sides have shown themselves to be an identity, the relation of condition and ground has disappeared. The two are reduced to mere reflective shine. The absolutely unconditioned is, in its movement of positing and presupposing, only the movement in which this shine sublates itself. It is the fact's own doing that conditions itself and places itself as ground over against its conditions. But in connecting conditions and ground, the fact is a reflection shining in itself. Its relation to them is a rejoining itself. C. Procession of the fact into concrete existence. The absolutely unconditioned is the absolute ground that is identical with its condition, the immediate fact as the truly essential. As ground, it refers negatively to itself and makes itself into a positedness, but this positedness is a reflection that is complete in both its sides and is in them the self-identical form of connection, and has transpired from its concept. This positedness is, therefore, first the sublated grounds, the fact as an immediacy void of reflection, the side of the conditions. This is the totality of the determinations of the fact itself. But the fact is thrown into the externality of being, the restored circle of being. In condition, essence lets go of the unity of its immanent reflection, but it lets it go as an immediacy that now carries the character of a being in a conditioned presupposition, and of essentially constituting only one of its sides. For this reason, the conditions are the whole content of the fact, because they are the unconditioned in the form of formless being. But because of this form, they also have yet another shape, besides the conditions of the content, as this is in the fact as such. They appear as a manifold without unity, mingled with extra essential elements and other circumstances that do not belong to the circle of existence as constituting the conditions of this determinate fact. For the absolute, unrestricted fact, the sphere of being itself is the condition. The ground, returning into itself, posits that sphere as the first immediacy to which it refers as to its unconditioned. This immediacy, as sublated reflection, is reflection in the element of being, which thus forms itself as such into a whole. Form proliferates as determinateness of being, and thus appears as a manifold, distinct from the determination of reflection, and as a content indifferent to it. The unessential, which is in the sphere of being, but which the latter sheds in so far as it is condition, is the determinateness of the immediacy into which the unity of form has sunk. This unity of form, as the connection of being, is in the latter, at first, as becoming, the passing over of a determinateness of being into another. But the becoming of being is also the coming to be of essence, and a return to the ground. The existence that constitutes the conditions, therefore, is in truth not determined as conditioned by another, and is not used by it as material. On the contrary, it itself makes itself, through itself, into the moment of another. Further, the becoming of this existence does not start off from itself as if it were truly the first and immediate. On the contrary, its immediacy is something only presupposed, and the movement of its becoming is the doing of reflection itself. The truth of existence is thus that it is conditioned. Its immediacy is solved by virtue of the reflection of the ground connecting that posits itself as sublated. Consequently, like immediacy, becoming is only the reflective shine of the unconditioned, inasmuch as this presupposes itself and has its form in this presupposing. And hence, the immediacy of being is essentially only a moment of the form. The other side of this reflective shining of the unconditioned is the ground connection as such, determined as form, as against the immediacy of the conditions and the content. But this side is the form of the absolute fact that possesses the unity of its form with itself, or its content within it, and in determining this content as condition, in this very positing sublates the diversity of the content and reduces it to a moment. Just as contrariwise, as a form void of essence, in this self-identity it gives itself the immediacy of subsistence. The reflection of the ground sublates the immediacy of the conditions, connecting them and making them moments within the unity of the fact. But the conditions are that which the unconditioned fact itself presupposes, and the latter, therefore, sublates its own positing. Consequently, its positing converts itself just as immediately into a becoming. The two, therefore, are one unity. The internal movement of the conditions is a becoming, the return into the ground and the positing of the ground. But the ground as posited, and this means as sublated, is the immediate. The ground refers negatively to itself, makes itself into a positiveness, and grounds the conditions. In this, however, in that the immediate existence is thus determined as a positiveness, the ground sublates it, and only then makes itself into a ground. This reflection is therefore the self-mediation of the unconditioned fact through its negation. Or, rather, the reflection of the unconditioned is at first a presupposing, but this sublating of itself is immediately a positing, which determines. Secondly, in this positing, the reflection is immediately the sublating of the presupposed, and a determining from within itself. This determining is thus, in turn, the sublating of the positing. It is a becoming within itself. In this, the mediation, as a turning back to itself through negation, has disappeared. Mediation is simple reflection, reflectively shining within itself and groundless, absolute becoming. The fact's movement of being posited, on the one hand, through its conditions, and on the other hand, through its ground, now is the disappearing of the reflective shine of mediation. The process by which the fact is posited is accordingly a coming forth, a simple self-staging of the fact in concrete existence, the pure movement of the fact to itself. When all the conditions of a fact are at hand, the fact steps into concrete existence. The fact is, before it exists concretely. It is, first, an essence, or as unconditioned. Second, it has immediate existence, or is determined, and this in the twofold manner just considered, on the one hand, in its conditions, and on the other, in its ground. In the former case, it has given itself the form of external, groundless being. For, as absolute reflection, the fact is negative self-reference, and makes itself into its presupposition. This presupposed unconditioned is, therefore, the groundless immediate, whose being is just to be there, without grounds. If, therefore, all the conditions of the fact are at hand, that is, if the totality of the fact is posited as a groundless immediate, then this scattered manifold internally reflects itself. The whole fact must be there, within its conditions, or all the conditions belong to its concrete existence. For the all of them constitutes the reflection of the fact. Or again, immediate existence, since it is conditioned, is determined by form. Its determinations are therefore determinations of reflection. With the positing of one, the rest also are essentially posited. The recollecting of the condition is at first the foundering of the ground of immediate existence and the coming to be of the ground. But the ground is thereby a posited ground, that is, to the extent that it is ground, to the extent it is sublated as ground, and is immediate being. If, therefore, all the conditions of the fact are at hand, they sublate themselves as immediate existence and as presupposition, and the ground is equally sublated. The latter proves to be only a reflective shine that immediately disappears. This coming forth is thus the tautological movement of the fact to itself. Its mediation through the conditions and through the ground is the disappearing of both of these. The coming forth into concrete existence is therefore so immediate that it is mediated only by the disappearing of the mediation. Okay, so once again we have the lighter, right? The lighter has the condition of being able to light fires. That is the presupposition that we have for a lighter. Until we actually strike the flame, however, it is only a presupposition. Once you have struck the flame, the lighter reflects the fact that it can make a fire and becomes the fact that it is a lighter. But if, however, instead of lighting, it didn't, then it automatically sublates itself from the ground of being a lighter into being not a lighter. And so the conditions have changed, and therefore it has changed the ground. The fact proceeds from the ground, right? It's either a lighter or it's not, and you determine that fact by trying to create the fire. It is not grounded or posited by it in such a manner that the ground would still stay underneath as a substrate. On the contrary, the positing is the outward movement of ground to itself and the simple disappearing of it. Through its union with the conditions, it obtains the external immediacy and the moment of being. But it does not obtain them as a something external, nor by referring to them externally. Rather, as ground, it makes itself into a positiveness. Its simple essentiality rejoins itself in the positiveness, and in this sublating of itself, it is the disappearing of its difference from its positiveness, and is thus simple essential immediacy. It does not, therefore, linger on as something distinct from the grounded. On the contrary, the truth of the grounding is that in the grounding, the ground unites with itself, and its reflection into another is consequently its reflection into itself. The fact is thus the unconditioned, and, as such, equally so the groundless. It arises from the ground only so far as the latter has foundered and is no longer ground. It rises up from the groundless, that is, from its own essential negativity or pure form. This immediacy, mediated by the ground, and conditioned and self-identical through the sublating of mediation, is concrete existence. And that is going to bring us to the end of ground. Hopefully, I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a very difficult topic. I understand that I hold some unconventional beliefs and I have a tendency to step on toes when I relay those. It is not intentional, but it is not something that I apologize for. Hopefully the explanation with the lighter is enough, right? As long as you meet the conditions of the ground, it remains your ground. But once you no longer meet the conditions of the ground, it is no longer your ground, right? It is no longer a lighter if it doesn't light fires. Now it's just a piece of plastic. It has a completely different ground. I don't know that there's a whole lot more left for me to say, and this is already really long, and I am blessed beyond measure to be able to talk this long, but I do feel like this was fairly self-explanatory as we went along, and I really do kind of feel like an asshole for saying the lighter stuff. So I understand that for some people that's going to make it a little bit easier, and that's why I do it. If you like what I'm doing over here, let me know down below. Give me a like, share, a follow, throw me a comment if you agree or disagree with anything that was stated. Put it in the box down below. And if it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. If there is another work you would like to see me read or discuss, drop that in the box as well. And if you really like what I'm doing over here, hit me with that super thanks. Consider a membership or pick up a copy of my book. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete just the way that you are. And this has been Pit State. Peace.